Hey guys, so I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and comment for the algorithm. It really helps a lot more than you realize. Anyway guys, I'll get to the stories. Love you. I live in a 50-year-old 2-bedroom bungalow war-torn home. As a child growing up in this home, I've experienced things I couldn't explain. Things like the feeling of being watched, as well as the feeling of dread every time I was in the basement. My brother and I shared a rumpus room as a bedroom. In this room, we would often hear a lady screaming and a baby crying in the basement. We would often run screaming straight to my mom, but of course, she never believed us. The home had a real bad vibe to it, and it also had an aura that we couldn't explain. It was almost like the house was suffocating the life out of us. You could certainly feel the negative energy permeating. It had such a profound effect on my parents that they began fighting so bad that their relationship ended in divorce. I blamed the home. My baby sister would have nightmares. She would often see a man in her room pointing a rifle at her. Each time she would recognize this man, she would let out a blood-curdling scream, which would send my mom flying through the room. The presence would vanish pretty quickly, and after a few encounters with this entity, she never saw this ghost again. I often saw black shadows in my bedroom. There were 2 of them, and they would stand together, almost as if they were clutching each other's hands, and stare at me. It may have been only a few seconds, but in that moment of sheer terror, it seemed like hours to me. Whatever they were haunted me for years, and eventually stopped when I was 16. Shortly after those incidents at 16, my brother was unfortunately killed. He was a victim of a hit-and-run accident. Almost immediately after his death, my mother started to feel his presence, and even crediting him for saving her life. My mom was standing on a chair changing a light bulb. She lost her balance, and that was when she felt a small set of hands on her legs. She said that she legitimately felt a force hold her, as if those so-called imaginary hands stabilized her and prevented her from falling. On another occasion, my mom was washing the back landing floor and didn't realize that she was so close to the basement stairs. As she stood up, she lost her balance, and as she was trying to regain her balance, she felt a small set of hands on her bum push her back up to the landing. My mom would have died that day if she had fallen down the stairs. After my grandma had died, my mom was making her bed. Just as she went to fluff her pillows, there was an indentation of a head on an unused pillow on her bed. She believes it was her grandma. My mom would often come home and hear a male voice talking to her dog. The reason why we know it was speaking to her dog was because the voice said the name Honey, which is obviously the dog's name. The voice sounded so real and so clear that my mom really thought that someone had broken into her home. She quickly searched around, and no one was even there. Often the boarders who lived in the basement would often complain of having their arm grabbed in the middle of the night. They have also told my mom that she has a ghost of an old man in her basement. My mom said she had never seen this ghost or felt him. However, my sister had reported it while she was carrying a basket of laundry up the stairs. Also, her son kept looking back as if he was being chased. We have no clue who is haunting our house, but we feel that we may know who this is, the spirit of this old man. I grew up in a house in New York Mills, New York. I always thought that there was something wrong with me because of the occurrences that went on in this home. That's because, originally, I didn't attribute these supernatural hauntings to be paranormal in the slightest. I would just write them off as stress or a vivid imagination. But hey, if a bunch of other people experience some wacky experiences, then I guess there must be something wacky going on then, right? Anyways, I lived in this house the majority of my life, from the ages of 4 to 17. I always thought I heard and saw things. Mysterious shadows slowly moving around in the home, often late at night, and I gradually grew desensitized to them because I didn't think much of them. Occasionally, I still saw things that freaked me out, but again, I believe that I was either disturbed or was overly imaginative. I moved back to this home when I was 26 and lived there until I was 35, when financial issues caused the bank to take it from me. This place, I've learned, is very haunted. Even as a child, I would hear low guttural voices, almost as if were giants whispering to each other. I even saw shadows on the wall at night consistently, the day my grandmother died. My parents even saw a shape move down the stairs. The attic made crazy noises, but it was an old house, right? Wrong. Well, the house had originally been built in 1854 by an old Polish immigrant. He did indeed die there, of a heart attack. He was a good man, and a very good father. In the days when I brought my children to this house, the shadow was seen only going between the children's rooms. Sightings were always on the stairs leading downstairs, or between the upstairs bedrooms. It appears that he is an attentive father checking on his sick children. Just my theory. Well, the children did indeed become scared poopless at whatever it was checking in on them. My second oldest child was diagnosed with night terrors. I went into the area between the rooms and asked him to stop appearing, as it was scaring them, and it stopped for quite a while. A few years later, my wife's aunt came to visit. She walked over to my living room, looked over to the stairway, and ran like heck from the home. She refused to go any further than the kitchen. Well, as I said, we were kicked out of the home by the bank. This house has gone through 6, that's right, 6 owners since we left. It has only been 2 years since then. Why is that, I wonder? When I was 17, my mother, stepfather, and youngest sister moved into a house built around 1899. This is an old house in a steel mill town. It was very dirty when we moved in, with soot in the walls from a coal furnace that used to be in the basement. The first night we stayed there, I slept in the living room in a sleeping bag inside a bay window area. I felt very uneasy, as though I was being watched. Over the course of the next few days, I began to feel more and more uneasy, having heard various odd noises, which I attributed it to being such an old home, and having seen things move out of the corner of my eye. After our light renovations of the home, I took up residence in the basement, and the rest of my family took the other 2 upstairs bedrooms. The basement had several rooms, sections that led to the next, separated by doors. In the area I inhabited, we had a dividing wall built to create more of a room with less open space. One night I was laying in my bed, about to go to sleep after having read a book. I had a small light on next to my bed. Wall to wall, my basement room was about 35 feet long and 20 feet wide. Against the back wall was a small window. I settled into the blankets and looked up at the window and saw a huge black mass that looked like a mound. It started at each corner, bottom of the wall, and came to a rounded point in front of the window. I was so startled, all I could do was sink into my bed and cover my head. The next night I slept on the upstairs couch. Other occurrences. I was walking down the basement stairs, old wooden steps, very slick, about 14 of them, and slipped on the 5th step. The right side was blocked by a wall all the way down, but the left side opened to the basement, and next to the stairs was a tire jack with a metal pole sticking straight up. I just so happened to grab the rail before I slipped off the left side. I would have impaled myself on the tire jack, and when I did, my head flew back, and standing at the top of the stairs was a skinny male figure, shoulder-length dark hair, white t-shirt, jeans, and no face. He was quite solid. There was a window behind him in the hallway, hazing a white glow around him. My mother was pulling the lawnmower back into the basement by the way of the cellar door. She lost her footing and started to fall backwards. When she said she felt a hand in the small of her back, pushing her upright. A few years ago, I had LASIK surgery and moved to recover. I went to my mom's to sleep, away from my kids. I had decided to take a bath while my mom was watching TV. I got into the tub, and I started to hear the basement door slamming shut. This is a normal occurrence in the home, but this time, I thought it was Mom. I yelled out, "Are you up here, Mom?" And she said, "Yes, I'm watching TV." The doors kept slamming shut until I got out of the tub. I've seen things placed at the center of the dining room table fly off into the floor. When I had my first daughter, she was terrified to be left with my mom at the home. She was about 2 years old, playing in the dark front bedroom, when she said, "Thomas, don't." Thomas was the name of my sister's boyfriend, who wasn't home at the time. She was yelling at Thomas for taking her toys while she was trying to play. Another time we were in the basement, in my former room. She was in the doorway when she said, "Mommy, who's that man?" and pointed into the bay section with the bay window, shaped like the stairs bay section, just below it. She's gone into screaming fits upon entry of the front bedroom. I've seen the image of Joe walking behind me, reflected in the computer screen. We've all seen his head poking around the wall in the kitchen, in the area of the basement door. The basement doors between the kitchen and the second bedroom at the back of the home. My mom had the shower curtain ripped open on her. We hear heavy footsteps in the basement when no one's home. Our Joe seems harmless enough. But what of the black mass in the basement? Is there another force to the house beside Joe? Sometimes we think so. When I was in my early 20s, I had one of only a few experiences with what I would consider the supernatural that truly frightened me. We were in our home in North Carolina, which was on top of a mountain with a terrific view of the Smokies. Everything about the home was warm and comfortable, except one night. That night, there was no indication that something really evil was about to show itself. We all went to bed as normal. My dad wasn't home with us, so my little sister was upstairs with my mother in her room. My brother was in his bedroom, and I was in mine. Everything settled down to a noiseless, deep darkness. The next thing I knew, our dog, a German Shepherd Collie mix, jumped up on the bed and started to walk up onto my chest and stared down at me. It occurred to me that there was very little weight to her. Now this was a 50-pound plus dog. I knew something wasn't right. Then, as I looked at her and tried to speak, her eyes started to glow an eerie reddish glow. The whole feel was of some extreme evil. This was absolutely not my dog. It was something trying to take on her image to get to me. I somehow jumped from under the being and reached for the light switch. As the light came on, there was nothing in the room. I thought perhaps it was a dream, but I truly did get to the switch. The lights did come on, and I did feel the being walk up on me. I truly don't believe, in my heart, that it was a dream. I ran through the house to make certain that the evil was gone, and I wanted to make sure my dog was okay. Sure enough, our dog was in my brother's room and looked up sleepily when I opened the door. She was fine, and not at all the evil thing that had been in my room. The evil tried unsuccessfully a couple of additional times to get to me. I'll put these experiences in writing soon. However, the first occasion was the worst, as he used a familiar, loved creature as its disguise. This story is about a 3-year-old girl who haunts this place. The trailer my brother has rented has been rented many times, so I don't know its history, but his 3-year-old stepdaughter will be talking to herself, so he thought. And so one day, she was crying, and her mom asked her what was wrong. She said the man grabbed her by the arm, and her mom asked her what man, and she said the one that talks to me. And so when her mom looked at her arm, she had a red ring around her arm. One day she was in the living room sitting on her knees, looking up and talking, and my brother asked her who she was talking to, and she turned around, and she said the man. Her mom took pictures of her, so when they downloaded it to the computer, and on the first picture, where she was looking up, there was a bright circle on that wall where she was looking. In the picture where she turned around, the circle moved down, and in a mirror that was all the way to the top of the wall, there was a man's head looking down at her. And when she showed it, she said, "Mommy, that's the man that talks to me, and sometimes he hurts me." I really love your website, and I've been debating sending you my story for some time now. I've always been fascinated with hauntings and ghosts, but I've never had any desire to have direct contact with them myself. However, recent events have confirmed that I've been in direct contact. Whether I like it or not, we came to the conclusion that our apartment was haunted shortly before we moved out. We had already made the decision to leave based on another of other factors, but realizing it was haunted really sealed the deal. We lived there for 2 years and experienced stuff that can be chalked up to living in an old apartment, but we've experienced so much of it that it just doesn't make any sense. When we first looked at the place, I was not into it at all. I felt that it had a really crappy vibe, and the landlady was crazy, but my husband really loved the place, so I agreed to move in, and we both worked really hard to make it a home. The first day we moved in, some neighborhood kids scribbled "This is the scary ghost house" in permanent marker on the front steps. It may seem silly, but it certainly gave me some reservations. We rented the whole first floor in the basement. I had been petrified of the basement since we moved in, and would not go down there alone for months. In an attempt to cleanse the apartment, we lit sage smudges and clapped out the corners, and we sprinkled holy water everywhere. I'm sure it helped, but I'm too scared to think of how things would be if we hadn't done any of that. Every major appliance broke down when we moved in. We had inexplicable computer problems. We could never seem to get the house clean. We were burglarized twice. We're both people with lots of friends, and we love entertaining. Strangely, people wouldn't come to the apartment. Bands would stay over, but they always stayed over once and never came back. Whenever I put something down and looked for it later, it was never where I put it, and I would spend 10 minutes looking for it before it reappeared, right where I put it down in the first place. Our bed shook in the middle of the night, which is frightening. It always happened when I was almost asleep, and I tried to write it off as my imagination. We both had inexplicable health problems. We were constantly tired and worn out, and we became very depressed and negative. Finally, one morning, my husband confirmed all of my suspicions. I'd asked him before if he thought the house is haunted, and he always said no. Uncategorically denied any such thing. So I stopped mentioning stuff to him because I didn't want to freak either of us any more than we already were. However, all the same things had been happening to him, and he confirmed that the bed shaking thing happened when I was out of town, and he was sleeping alone too. In fact, he has seen whatever it is at the top of the basement steps at least 3 times. He describes it as a crouched old man heading back down the basement steps. He fell down the basement steps when he first moved in, and the first weekend he was home with crutches. I had to be out of town, and he was home alone. There was no way he could get around without the crutches, and when he woke up one morning, the crutches weren't in the bedroom. He found them in the living room, at the other end of the apartment. During the last summer we lived there, the upstairs apartment was unoccupied and being renovated. No one was up there. One night when we were lying in bed, we heard footsteps upstairs in the room overhead. We went up to check it out, and there was no one there. We kept our cat's water and food bowls at the top of the basement steps. The cat started waking up at 4 or 5 and would want me to stay with her while she ate. I think that whatever was in the house was harassing her when she tried to eat, and if I was there, it would leave her alone. Knowing all this confirmed and explained a lot of stuff. We felt like we were struggling to keep our heads above water. We both felt lethargic and depressed. When we would come home, we both did a full walk of the apartment and checked every room before we felt like we could settle in. My other experience, that I am sure of, is a much more positive one. I'm very close to my stepfather, and I was very close to his mother as well. I consider her my third grandmother. She died last year, and my stepfather was devastated. We planned to bury her ashes in the same cemetery her husband and mother are buried in. My stepfather was in a relationship with a woman for 9 years who died in his arms, and she is buried there as well. When we got to the cemetery, we discovered that a plot had not been dug for my grandmother's ashes, and my stepfather couldn't remember where they were buried, or whether or not they had headstones or flatstones. My whole family was wandering around the cemetery, reading all the headstones and trying to find out where the family was buried. Finally, I asked my grandmother's mother to help me find them. Where were they? I turned around and tripped over a buried flatstone. It was the marker for my stepfather's girlfriend who had died in his arms. All 3 graves were in a row, and they were so overgrown with grass, I doubt I would ever have found them without help. Hi again. I submitted a story about the apartment I used to live in a few weeks ago, but I have another story about the house my family and I are currently living in, which is my grandmother's. I'm not sure what to make of it, but I think the house my family and I currently live in may be haunted. We've been living there for almost 2 years now. First of all, my great-grandparents, my dad's grandparents, were living there, then passed away at that house before I was born. Then, when I was 7 years old, my grandfather passed away in the same house, of cancer. I remember that, because my parents and I spent the night there, the night he died. I'm not sure, but sometimes I think the house is haunted, and other times I'm not so sure. It's been months since I've heard any noises, or felt anything unusual, but that's how it's been. Another important note, my grandma doesn't live there. She lives with her boyfriend in Castroville, a small town about 30 minutes away. She's only there for a few weeks and stays for one night, then goes back to Castroville. Anyway, a couple weeks after we moved in, my husband said he wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but he sometimes heard footsteps in the kitchen late at night, after everyone was asleep, and he was the only one up. I hadn't heard anything yet, until a few weeks after he told me that. Another thing that happened was I found a cabinet door open in the laundry room, when no one had been in there. My son couldn't have reached it, because it's too high. Then early one morning, I heard noises in the kitchen and laundry room, and footsteps too. I was really scared, too scared to investigate, so I just sat up in bed and listened. Of course, everyone else was sleeping. My husband was also awake in bed one night, while everyone was asleep, and I happened to wake up too. He asked me, "Did you see that?" I didn't see anything, so I asked him what he saw, and he said that he saw something round and black, hovering about 4 feet from the ground, in the doorway. He said that he thought it was a spider, but it was too big. Then he said after a few seconds it kind of vibrated, and dashed away real fast. He dismissed it as his imagination, due to the fact that he was so tired, and so did I. A few months later, my 7-year-old son said he saw a foot shadow floating back and forth in front of his door. His door was closed, and we were still in bed, but he said he saw it through the crack under the door. I told him he was dreaming, but he said he was awake, and insisted that's what he saw. I've never seen anything directly, but occasionally I've seen a figure walk by in another room from my peripheral vision when I know I'm the only adult in the home. The figure is too tall to be my son, but a little shorter than my husband. And of course, when I look directly where I saw it, no one is around. I told a friend at work about my grandma's house, and she said let me borrow your digital camera for the evening. I took several pictures, all at night, and several orbs came out in some of the pictures. I'll have to send those if I can find them. In one of them, there's an orb that appears to have a face resembling my grandfather's. Then late one night when my husband was away at a DJ gig, I was asleep and woke to the strong feeling that I was not alone in the room. I didn't have a dream or anything. I just suddenly awoke, startled, and my heart was pounding. It felt like there was another presence in the room with me, and I scanned the room good, but I didn't see anyone. That was really, really weird, and I've never had that happen to me before. I didn't like that feeling of it at all. I felt scared. It's been months since anything out of the ordinary has happened, but recently while I was laying in bed, my kids were asleep, and my husband was at work. I kept hearing noises in the kitchen and laundry area again. It took me a while to fall asleep, and I was a little scared. I was worried someone was trying to get in the home, but was too scared to get up and look, So I took a golf club and put it next to the bed. The weird thing is, we finally purchased a digital camera recently and took several photos in the home with no orbs appearing, but the pictures were all taken during the day. I'm going to take a few pictures at night to see if anything came out. I asked my grandma about the home, and she said it's not haunted, and nothing's ever happened there, and she's never heard nor seen anything. I even told my dad, and he says the same. Does anybody have any ideas? I've been looking at your website for the last couple of weeks, and I've read some of the experiences people had with the supernatural. I've had several experiences in my life. The first one that I can really remember is when my grandmother died. I was 16 years old and lived most of my life with my grandma. The night she passed away from cancer, I was devastated since I never got to say goodbye to her. But the night she passed, she came back to say goodbye to me. I remember being in that state between awake and asleep. I remember her coming to my bed, sitting beside me, and telling me she was perfectly fine and so happy to be with my grandpa. I told her I loved her, and she left. The second thing that happened was about 2 months after I had my third child. We moved into a beautiful home in Northwest Ohio. It had been totally remodeled, except for one room upstairs, in which we made into a toy room for the kids. My daughter, who was 2 at the time, was in that room playing when she started screaming for me. I ran up the stairs to see what was wrong with her, and she was in a corner with her hands protecting her head and screaming for the bad man to go away. I did not see a man. I picked her up and headed back downstairs, and when I was on the 3rd or 4th step down, I felt as if someone was behind me and very angry with me. Needless to say, I ran the rest of the way down. Also in that home, I was in the kitchen washing my son's bottles, and directly behind the sink was our stove. I'd placed my son in the carrier by the stove. My daughters had brought in their stuffed animals that my mother had gotten them for Easter and laid them down beside the stove. Now, these stuffed animals were the kind that make noise, as in the duck quacked, the pig oinked, and the cow mooed. I know my son was just a little bit too young to be able to reach over his carrier and play with the toys, let alone make them talk. While I was washing his bottles, the duck started in. I thought nothing of it. I thought maybe it was just malfunctioning. But then the cow started in, and a few seconds after that, the pig. I turned around, and my son was just all smiles. Needless to say, I hightailed it out of the home. I always hated to go into the basement of that house. It just felt wrong for me to be down there. But one afternoon, I had no choice but to go down. I had to take a bag of old clothing down to be stored. I thought I would just leave them on the floor, right at the bottom of the steps. So I leaned down to retie the bag, and as soon as I look up, I saw 2 little girls standing right in front of me. They were not my little girls. They looked about 7 and 5 years old, and let me tell you, I didn't waste any time getting up these stairs. They did not make me feel very safe. I did some research on the home and found that the house was built in the mid-1800s. A man and his family lived in the home, and he had 2 daughters. The man owed some money to a loan shark, and when he couldn't repay his debt, the loan shark killed the 2 daughters and buried them in the basement. My family and I didn't stay long in that house. The longer we stayed, the more evil it seemed to be. The most recent experience has been for the last 2.5 years. My father passed away, and I've had a very hard time dealing with his passing. I was made to make all of his decisions when it came to taking him off of life support. I felt, and still feel, guilty for letting him go. I know that my dad comes to visit me, and I hope he never stops visiting. I don't let anyone smoke in my home, and my dad hated it. He hated to go outside in the garage. He was always on my case about it. Well, now that Dad has passed away, there are many nights, and even days, that you can smell cigarette smoke so plainly, like it's right next to you. I know it's my dad, and I tell him to take it to the garage, and he does. I know that he's looking out for me and my family. I just wish he would show himself to me just one more time. Thank you so much for your website. It's a comfort knowing that I'm not alone, and definitely not crazy. This story involves my aunt and uncle, and took place in the late 70s and early 80s. My aunt and uncle, and then baby cousin, lived in a nice modest house in Upland, California, a very nice little city near Panola in Ontario. The niceness of the house didn't last long, and almost immediately, my family began experiencing weird things. Every night on the way to bed, my uncle would latch close the door to the spare bedroom across the hall from he and my aunt's master bedroom. Every morning, as he passed the same door, it would discreetly unlatch and push itself open on its own. This same room once locked in my uncle's sister, with her and my uncle both frantically turning and pushing and pulling on the door as things flew out of the closet at her. All at once, everything stopped, and they both jumped back to have the door unlatch and push itself open, as it always did. Needless to say, my uncle's sister didn't stay much longer in the bedroom, let alone the home. When my aunt would leave the home to run errands in the daytime, she would return to find all the pictures from the wall on the ground, not knocked over, but propped against the wall, directly under the nail it was once hanging on. This would happen nearly every time the house was left empty, no matter how many times they would put the items back on the wall. Another nightly struggle was the pounding up and down the walls, like someone banging their fist across the center of the wall, back and forth, back and forth. My own grandma, as well as my mom and dad, witnessed this and hightailed it out of there ASAP. One day in the summer, my cousin, who was about 2 or 3, was sitting in a high chair next to a long hallway. My aunt was just outside the back door. My cousin asked, "Mommy, who's that man in the hallway?" My aunt, not quite listening, asked back somewhat distracted, "What man?" My cousin proceeded to explain that the man looked like her Uncle Mike, who lived out of state. When my family had finally decided that enough was enough, they decided to sell the home and move to Kalamazoo, just outside of Yucapeka, California. On one of their last nights in the home, it seemed as if everything was going crazy. The pounding was out of control. There were loud bangs and unusual noises everywhere, and their dog was at the front door, its hair on end, and growling out the front porch. My aunt and uncle looked outside to the wraparound driveway and saw their van rocking back and forth as if people were inside jumping around. Within seconds, everything had stopped. Once my family had moved out, they eventually learned that their house was built over an old Indian burial ground. I've tried to ask my aunt more about this story, but she'll rarely talk about it, and I think is subconsciously trying to block it out. My aunt and uncle are very straight-laced, and don't make up these sort of things. And I think that if my other family members had not been there to witness a lot of them, I would not even know about these occurrences in Upland. I've had to rely on my mom retelling me what she remembers, my aunt telling her as it was happening. There are probably many more things that went on that I would love to find out. I still don't even know the address of this old home, see if the place still exists. As for the significance of Uncle Mike, my cousin's Uncle Mike had long, black flowing hair with darkly tanned skin and often wore a leather band across his forehead. Think 70s rocker fashion, looking somewhat like an Indian perhaps. This happened quite recently. Well, a few weeks ago actually. Apart from what I think are a few cases of what I think are more likely sleep paralysis with resulting hallucinations, this is the only experience I felt that was truly, well, weird. A bit of background first. I live alone and rent an apartment in a newly built block, one of 3, of low-rise units. These were built on the grounds of an old public primary school, which is over 100 plus years old. The far end of the strip of where the school used to be is preserved, and still has the school hall, a beautiful sandstone building, and is used for public functions. My particular block is built where the playgrounds etc. used to be. I know this as I grew up in the area, and remember the school when I was a teenager, though I did not go there, and remember what it used to look like beforehand. I'm personally unaware of any hauntings in the area, nor am I unaware of the history of the site, as I've not researched it. There is a fairly modern funeral based directly across the road containing offices, a small chapel, and a large garage with several hearses. Whilst I assume bodies are prepared there, etc. there are no burials. The story. I had a very hard day at work, and have been under a lot of stress. It was a Friday night, fairly late, and I eventually decided to go to bed. I had a lot of trouble sleeping, as my mind was working 100 miles per hour. You know the feeling. I simply couldn't turn it off. After staring at the ceiling for an hour, I became frustrated, and finally, I thought I'd open my mind and try to meditate. It was an effort, but after almost half an hour of this, I drifted off. Shortly after, I had an odd feeling, and I woke up and opened my eyes. I immediately noticed a web of white mist floating above me. This network of yellow-white colored mist was basically sort of like a spider web about a meter above my bed, and almost stretching across the entire room. Actually, the whole room was a bit foggy in general. I blinked, and then did a I don't think so double take, and rubbed my eyes. No sleep paralysis this time. It was still there. I tried to focus my eyes on it, and it was not easy. But what I saw was what I thought were transparent faces, outlined in the mist. The effect was very like the outline of an invisible person in smoke. One moved through on my right side and looked directly at me. The fear started to hit me now, but I tried to calm myself down and think rationally. Just hold on here. I might be seeing things just because I'm so tired and stressed, and I've just woken up too. I forced myself to be distracted and take my attention away. I shifted position in bed, closed my eyes, rubbed them, blinked them several times, and looked over at my clock radio. It was about 1:10, I think. Then looked back up, and it was still there. I then started to feel a slight vibration in my bed. Not a strong one, just like you'd feel the ground at a station as a train went past. I remember thinking, what the? And thought at first it was just my body shivering because I was cold or I had a muscle twitch. My attention on this now, I flexed my muscles a few times, and then tried to hold still and feel it was still there. The bed was definitely vibrating, even a bit more pronounced now. I was getting quite frightened, and not knowing what else to do, short of running out of the bedroom, I began to recite a prayer softly, and also verbalize what I wanted any spirits to leave the place. Basically anything that came to mind, just in case I wasn't imagining things. After about a minute of this, it faded. After a while, I wanted to go back to sleep, as I was super tired, but every minute or so, I was worried it was still there, so I snapped my eyes open to check. It had gone. A few minutes after that, I fell asleep again, with no more events that night. Now after the event, when I think about it, I wonder if it was just my imagination, or something else. What surprised and concerned me is that I felt very lucid. I felt quite clear-headed. The only other event which is vaguely similar, which I dismissed at the time, was about a year ago when I woke up in the early hours of the morning to see a similar face above, and to the left of my bed, no mist, looking at me. I rather sheepishly recall in the shock yelling and then punching it. Honestly, who punches a ghost? Seemed to work though. The action either jolted me out of my sleep hallucination or made whatever it was go away. I'm not sure what to make of the above event, to be honest. As a general comment in my apartment itself, I don't typically feel anything strange or a presence, and other than this, there have been no odd things going on. Plenty of unusual sounds, mind you, but I'm fairly sure these come mostly from the neighbors, etc. Usually from what I read about hauntings, they tend to be more or less repetitive, and don't just hit you like that and go away. So I'm still not 100% convinced it wasn't a half dream. But still, what a freak out. I now believe that I officially have a poltergeist in my home. At first, my live-in boyfriend thought I was nuts. Now, he believes it too. The first day I moved in, I was doing laundry in the basement. My cats both began acting strangely and circled me whenever I was in the basement. I thought they were just hungry and trying to get my attention. But when I waited out to go upstairs, I had this terrible feeling that someone was standing behind me, staring right through me. The 12-year-old inside me told me to run up the stairs like I did when I was a kid. And I did. Then, one day, I was looking for my favorite tank top. I couldn't find it anywhere, and could swear that I brought it to this new house. I dismissed it as having it left somewhere. The third day we lived in this house, I broke my ankle playing softball. I ended up having to sleep on the couch in the living room. Throughout my 2-month stay on the sofa, I could swear I heard someone going up and down the basement steps, cold breezes, etc. I just thought that the pain medication was kicking in, and that my mind was playing tricks on me. After I could walk again, and venture into the basement to do the laundry, I still had the same feeling that someone was standing behind me and staring at me. One night, I was getting ready to fall asleep in the bedroom when my boyfriend was out of town fishing. I had both dogs in the room, one on the bed, and the cats too, and the dog on the floor next to the bed. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud thump, like a book had just fallen off a bookshelf and onto the hardwood floor. Well, I don't have any bookshelves in the bedroom, nor was anything on the floor, except for clothes, when I turned the light on. Just this last week, I came home to discover the bed neatly made, pillows stacked just so, and the blankets pulled up neatly and turned down. When I thank my boyfriend for making the bed, He just stared at me. He said, "What are you talking about?" And I said that I didn't know what got into him to make the bed so nice, but it was a nice thing to do. He said, though, that I came home on my lunch hour and made the bed. He had been gone all day and didn't come home until I was already home. The basement lights continually go on and off. The light switches don't work, and the light bulbs are new. The circuits have been checked and everything is fine. I never know when they will work. The other night, the toilet handle in the bathroom jiggled for 10 minutes straight at 3 a.m., and we both heard it. The night before last, my boyfriend witnessed a light come on in the hallway outside our bedroom and had heard the light switch flip. The light faded, and later when he got up to go to the bathroom, the kitchen light was on, which had been off when we went to bed. Last night, I saw a light come into our bedroom from the hallway and then fade. I also heard a very loud thump at the foot of my bed. When I got up, only my tennis shoes were in the floor, hardwood floor, and nothing else had fallen off or was out of place. It was so loud, I physically jumped when I heard it. My boyfriend was sound asleep. I am convinced that someone or something is totally screwing with me. This is a very personal story to my family, but I think your readers might find it as fascinating as I do. My mother grew up in an infamous mental institution in Massachusetts, now closed, and I won't name the facility for privacy's sake. She was placed in state custody in 1948 at 6 years old because my grandmother, a Portuguese gypsy immigrant and closet psychotic, claimed she was mentally disturbed. In actuality, my grandmother was just not capable of raising her, so she successfully pawned her off on the state. My mother was not only a beautiful and innocent child, but was totally mentally capable and 100% sane. In those days, there was no system in place to accurately assessing a child's medical condition. They simply took the parents' word for it. After living at various orphanages and state facilities, she ended up at this institution just outside of Boston. The place is notorious for paranormal activity, even on the outer grounds where some of the buildings once stood. She was about 12 when she got there. She said that there were many physically and mentally incapacitated young people there, and the stories she told us about the school, or institution, were both heartbreaking and terrifying. There were mental abuses, deprivations, beatings, medical experiments on patients, and cruel punishments galore. So-called professional care was barbaric, and even the terminology was outdated. My mother's own records, which I've seen myself, showed her mental assessment as moron, even though she said she was never really tested by any mental health professional. When she was around 13, she began helping the patients whenever she could. She would bandage their injuries, break up fights, and speak to the matrons on behalf of those who could not speak. This created enemies among the staff, who knew she wasn't handicapped and who felt she was a threat to their employment. Therefore, whenever they could, they punished her severely. One such punishment led to a horrifying encounter with the supernatural. One dark, stormy afternoon, Mom had words with a matron, trying to tell her that certain handicapped children were frightened of the thunder and that they should not be forced to go outside to exercise that afternoon. The matron appeared to give in, then asked my mother to please go down into the cellar of the building to get to the rain gear for those who wanted to go outside. Mom was terrified of that cellar, and the matron knew it. There was this long, steep, narrow, and rickety stairway, ending at a long dark hallway with no windows and just a tiny yellowish light bulb in the ceiling. At the end of the hallway, there was a cabinet that contained raincoats, boots, etc. When my mother hesitantly stepped onto the stairway, the matron slammed a door, bolted it shut behind her, and shut off the light. My mother screamed and pounded on the door for an hour, only to be laughed at by matrons who had been instructed to let her spend the entire night down there. The stairs being steep and dangerous, she decided that she would rather creep to the bottom and at least huddle on the damp floor. As she descended, she noticed a dim light coming from the long hallway beneath her. She came to the bottom of the stairs and looked around. She said she saw a man in a dark jumpsuit about 20 feet from her, leaping against a wall and just smiling at her. She thought he must have been a custodian, so she walked towards him, asking him to please let her out. But as she approached him, he kept getting further away. She realized he was not a sullen being, and that the dim light seemed to be coming from his outline. The light began to fade, and she found herself screaming again, only in the total dark of the dingy basement. She was disoriented and stumbled forward until she bumped into the cabinet which held the rain gear. As she squinted in the dark, she began to make out shapes forming on either side of the cabinet. What appeared to be a pair of detached hands forming a clawed shape were each coming from around opposite sides of the cabinet and heading for her. She turned and ran, faint with terror, until she tripped on the bottom step. Frozen with fear, she could only sit at the bottom step and cover her face with her hands. After a minute or so, she peeked through her fingers down the hallway. The strange dim light was back. She chanced to look down, and what she saw filled her with horror. One of the smoky floating hands were reaching for her skirt, as if to pull at it. She again screamed and ran back up the stairs, tripping and falling several times in the dark, convinced she was being chased. The air was cold, and she heard a strange rustling sound behind her as she frequently climbed. When she reached the top of the stairs, she pounded furiously on the door and found that it had been unlocked. She never found out who unlocked it, but she didn't care either. She ran all the way to her room and hid on her bed. She never told the school staff what had happened, fearing reprisals, and she never set foot in that cellar again, despite the punishment of defiance. She's fine today, despite her horrific youth. There were many other strange things happening during her stay, but I'm considering a book about them, and I wanted to reap the benefits of the sales if it happens. I'll save the creepiest stuff for that. I've had many paranormal experiences since I was a young child. At the age of 4, my mother and grandmother would visit the graves of my father and grandfather, staying all day. I would play with the little girl there, while my grandmother and mother sat and talked. They believed I had an imaginary playmate. Both are now dead themselves. I decided to check the records of the cemetery, and had little trouble since it is a small place. I found one girl that could have been the one that I played with. Her name was Mary Jane Walker, and she died in 1866, at the age of 9 years of age. My husband and I decided to see if we could find the girl's grave. I told him to check the back of the cemetery because that was where we played. He found the grave. I asked Mary Jane if I could take her picture. I took 3 of the grave, and one of my husband, sitting on a tree stump not far away. I had the pictures developed. All the pictures were normal, except for the one of my husband where there appears to be a vortex in it. I've looked for all the usual problems, I can find no rational explanation for this. I now feel that I have proof of my friend's existence. My husband and I rented a home in southwest Detroit in the 1980s that was very haunted. The first thing that happened was when I was waiting for the gas company to come turn the gas on. I felt as though there was someone watching me, and I smelled pipe tobacco. I figured, okay, I'm alone in a strange place. I also thought that maybe the people who lived in the front part of the house used pipe tobacco. I found out later that these people were from India and were visiting that country. They moved out within a week of returning to the US. All the problems in the house seemed to originate in the attic. There was a log cabin built up there for children to play in. It was complete with glass in the windows and a drawstring latch for the door. I was only in there once, but the feeling of uneasiness I felt was real. We never allowed our children to play in it. The attic door had no lock, but my 5-year-old daughter got locked in and was screaming for us to let her out. Although you could hear any noise from upstairs, we never heard her. The door opened on its own. I started to dream about an old Indian woman with a pockmarked face. Since this was a dream, I never told anyone about it. One day, a woman I had become friendly with asked me if my mother was visiting. I told her I sure hope not, since my mother was dead. She said that she saw a woman with long black hair in my bedroom window. This sort of freaked me out, since I was dreaming of that Indian woman, and she had long black hair. One day this friend was visiting me, and we were sitting in the kitchen having coffee and talking about nothing really. She seemed to go into a daze and was starting to go up to my attic. In fact, she was insisting that she was going. I got her back to the table and sitting down when something punched her head hard enough to leave a red mark. She left and refused to come visit anymore. My husband and I had cleaned out the basement, but yet my kids found a Ouija board down there. They showed us where it was, and we got rid of it right away. We don't mess with that thing. Things seemed to quiet down for a couple of weeks when the apartment in front of us was rented to a young couple. They started to have problems right away. The keys hanging on the wall would begin to sway. The rocker in the front room would start rocking by itself. At first, things only happened at night, but people decided to contact this thing, and things got bad from then. She would get phone calls, and when she answered, no one would be on the line, except one time. She told me a voice told her to get out. We are Christians, and decided enough was enough. We had to have help. I turned on the radio to listen to evangelical echoes and called a prayer line for suggestions on what to do. This program wasn't on yet, but another one was, and someone on that program was praying in the spirit. Suddenly from the basement came an unearthly howl. Needless to say, this woman and I got out of the house and waited on the front porches for our husbands to get home. While all this was going on, my husband never noticed anything. One night, my nephew was spending the night, and while he was praying, this thing shot from our apartment to the other one, banging things in its haste to leave. My nephew refused to stay another night. One night, my husband was in bed sleeping, and I was on my way up when I asked the man in the next apartment to go wake him up and tell him to come sleep on the couch. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him I could see my husband in pieces. He did, and the couch was occupied that night. The only thing my husband noticed was that one night we were watching TV, and it sounded like a dresser was being dragged down the stairs. He heard that. We moved from there, and the next place was no better. Whatever was there caused arguments. My nephew and his then girlfriend were constantly fighting, and it got so bad that my husband and I started fighting as well. This was something we normally didn't do. We had the normal arguments that married people usually have, but this was getting serious. Even one of my children was being affected by this thing. It was appearing to her as a little girl talking to her. At first it was nice to her, but as time went on, it was starting to get mean. We had bought this one house, and it might sound silly, but the best thing that ever happened was that an arsonist burned us out, and we had to move. We have had no problems since. I don't believe this was a ghost, but rather a demon, and why it hasn't followed us, I have no idea, but I thank God that it hasn't. I have more stories, but I've taken up enough time as it is. I'm glad that I can finally tell this story without fear of people ridiculing me. There's a place in Smithfield, Virginia called Bacon's Castle. It's not really a castle, just a gigantic plantation home. They give tours there on a daily basis. It was in the summer of 2003 that I went with a summer creative writing group to tour this magnificent home and plantation. As we toured the home, the tour guide told us all of the kinds of stories of happenings and how the house was shifted from family to family. When we went up the stairs, we were greeted by a sudden draft. As my friends and I sauntered through the home, it didn't get warmer. In fact, it got colder. The best part was when we reached the room where the woman and her husband would have stayed. There was also a small cradle in the center of the room. The tour guide spoke of a woman during the Civil War who stayed in the room for months after her baby was born because something went wrong with the birth, and the child was terribly sick. When the child died, the woman wouldn't leave the cradle. She remained there, convinced she had to rock her to sleep. She wouldn't eat or sleep, and eventually, she too died. As I stared into the room, I didn't notice anything. My friend Crystal had asked me if I felt a breeze. When I said I didn't, she said she didn't either, and pointed at the cradle, which was swaying back and forth noticeably. I didn't really think much of it, and after everyone left, I took a picture and then followed my friends up the stairs to the attic. A few weeks later, I was looking through my pictures, and something caught my eye in the picture of the room with the cradle in it. Sitting in front of the cradle was a woman dressed in Victorian-style dress. She was transparent, and a wispy hand had gripped the cradle. I looked even closer, and it looked as though she was smiling. Hello, my name is Ray, and I would like to share with you the experiences that happened to my small family in 1996. We had been transferred to the Houston area from San Antonio and found a 2-story 4-bedroom home in the Clear Lake City area. A real fix-it-upper, and it was the worst looking home in a very nice community called Green Acres. My brother-in-law Robert and her sister helped us for 6 months in remodeling, cleaning up, and making the place a nice home. Robert had sold his own home 2 years earlier and lived in a travel trailer, but missed his home. He jumped in and was happy to do most of the work and was proud of the results. A month after the house was finished, we found out that Robert had terminal cancer and had less than 6 months to live. The trailer was small, and so my wife and I decided to bring Robert into our home for his final days. We put him downstairs in the formal living room, and with the help of hospice, we knew we could help Robert with a peaceful and quiet death. This was not the case. Robert fought hard for his life, and was terrified of death because he had fought in Vietnam and had killed many. He didn't know what was waiting for him on the other side. The end came with Robert fighting to get out of bed. The look on his face was one of horror. As per his request, he was left in his room for 6 hours after his death, and then the funeral home was called and Robert left. Or did he? The week after the funeral, things started not being right. Odd bumps and sounds from downstairs. Late at night, our dog would not go downstairs after dark, and furniture being moved. One morning, the living room sofa was standing on end with all the cushions still in place. Dining room chairs would be taken and lined along the living room wall, and mirrors would vibrate. We called the hospice minister to the house, and he blessed every room, but Robert still didn't leave. We did. The house stood vacant for a while, and new people moved in, but their stay was short. Neighbors say 2 families came and left. It has been 8 years now, and just a while back I was in the area and went by the home. It sits vacant again with a sale sign in the front yard, standing in front of the window of the room in which Robert died. As I stood there, remembering our last few months at home, a chill ran down my back, and I quickly got into my car to drive away. I sent a story to the site about 2 months ago. Is it my imagination or something paranormal? Well, since then, some new things have happened, and I found out some interesting information that I didn't know before. When I first sent out my story, I told my sister-in-law Jenna about it. She's a Jehovah's Witness too, but a little bit more open-minded than my mother-in-law. Anyway, I told her what I had wrote, and she told me she had a girlfriend when she was a teenager, about 15 years ago, that lived next door to her. The side where I heard the whispering, in the house where the old couple had died. I believe her family bought the house after the couple died. Anyway, she told her that her friend was a little odd, because she had been sleeping with her parents at night, but Jenna had found out later why. One night, she had stayed the night at her friend's house, and they slept in her friend's bed. Early in the morning, Jenna had woken up for some reason, and noticed that her friend was squirming a lot, and moaning, almost like she was doing the deed with someone, but no one was there. Her arms were at her side. So Jenna thought maybe she was having a dream. Then she thought that maybe she had seen imprints in her friend's body. She got startled with this, and woke her friend up, and told her what she had witnessed. Her friend got so upset about it, that she didn't want to talk about it at all, and never did. To say the least, Jenna never got asked again to stay another night. Then there is the other story that my mother-in-law told me recently, about my other sister-in-law's house, Linda, which is ironically across the street from my mother-in-law's, in the other house. About a shadow that lingers in her hallway, shaped like a person. They have all seen it, including my mother-in-law. She swears that there is an explanation for this, but even she has admitted that she can't find one. When she told me about the shadow, I got real nervous, and I started to get goosebumps and got real cold. I told her sometime last year when I stayed the night at Linda's house. I was sleeping on her couch in the living room, my back to the hallway. There was a small light on where the fish tank was, so it wasn't completely dark. For some reason I woke up and turned around, and I saw this dark shadow move from the open hallway and disappear into the instance of Linda's kitchen. I was startled at first, but then got up to investigate things, to see maybe it was the shadow of the fish tank, but there was no way it could have been with the position where the tank was. So I went back to sleeping, thinking it was just my imagination, and I never told anyone of that incident. That was until my mother-in-law said something. She told me not to say anything about it to Linda because she gets freaked out about it, and she said she'll still be looking for a logical explanation for it. Good luck on finding one in all 3 houses, I was thinking to myself. But one last thing. Back at my mother-in-law's house, a couple of weeks ago my niece Christine was staying the night, and my niece told me that when she got to the bathroom in the middle of the night, she came out running, screaming, and petrified out of the hallway. She told my niece, crying hysterically, that when she turned the corner to go into the hallway, that she saw a shadow figure walking towards her. My niece went to look, and nothing was there, and my 2-year-old daughter will not go near that hallway at all. One time I went to carry her down there to show her nothing was down there at all, and she started crying real hard, and grabbing my neck, and wouldn't let go, shaking badly. So whatever is in my mother-in-law's house is probably the same thing that are in the other 2 homes. Makes me wonder if it goes on in the other neighbors' houses. I was doing some just for fun ghost hunting with a couple of my friends one night in a cemetery on an old gravel road. 2 of my friends were out in the cemetery looking around, and my other friend decided to stay in the car. As the 2 guys were out in the far corner of the cemetery, I looked to the center of the graveyard and seen something that made me lose my breath for a few seconds. A blurry gray figure floated above one of the gravestones, and then looked to run through the air across 3 other stones, and then drop right behind another stone. After it disappeared, I asked my friend in the car with me if he had seen it too, and he said he did, and he was just as freaked out as me. It was not light that created this, because it was pitch black out there. It was my first, and so far only time, I've seen something like a ghost. Thank you for letting me share my story. I know this one was kinda short, but I appreciate it anyway. Hi, my name is Louise, and I live in Oxfordshire, England. The story I'm about to tell you happened only a few weeks ago and scared me and my friend to death. It was about 9:30 on a Sunday night, and I was bored, so I decided to call my friend Heather. We were talking about the usual, when all of a sudden, you could hear someone on the line breathing. Heather and I both said at the same time, "Do you hear that?" As we listened, it got louder until there was complete silence. At first we thought maybe one of our brothers or sisters were messing about, and picked up the phone on the other end. We both checked our houses, and no one was in there. My parents had gone out for a meal, and my brother and sister were out, and Heather didn't have any siblings, and there's only one phone in her house. Anyways, we forgot about it, and after about 10 minutes of talking, we heard it again, and this time, the voice said, "Help, I'm close." We both really freaked out, and said what the voice repeated it again, and then went. I told Heather that I would phone her later, and about an hour later, I phoned back, and we didn't hear anything for a while until the shriek came from the phone, from what sounded like a girl. We got so scared, and as soon as our parents got home, I told them what happened, and they said maybe our phone lines got crossed with someone else's. We still don't know who was on the line to this day. I know this wasn't very scary, but thanks for reading. Well, I've been a ghost hunter for quite some time now. I've submitted a few areas under the California section of the haunted places. I recently moved to Arkansas and bought a home in April. 3-in-1 rock house with a huge pond on 1.6 acres in Booneville, Arkansas. I fell in love with this house as soon as I saw that it said for sale by owner sign right in front of it. I called the number and they were selling it for $48,000. I thought, my God, this is cheap for such a beautiful home. I moved in. I have a 9-year-old son and 1 cat. About the end of July, I started hearing and seeing things. To begin with, I was laying in bed one night, and my 9-year-old and 6-year-old, who was visiting from California, were asleep in their rooms. All the lights were out. My bedroom door meets the living room. I was lying on my left side looking out into the black of the living room, and I heard what sounded like someone walking in it. Now, my sons sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and come sleep with me, so naturally I thought it was them. I called out their name. No answer. Then I thought maybe it was my cat, but then I noticed her laying at my feet on the bed. It really sounded like someone was walking from the kitchen in the living room entrance towards my room. Second, my television is hooked up to the stereo because the speaker on the TV is blown. Well, when I have to be at work at 11 p.m., I usually take a shower around 9:45 p.m., and my 9-year-old goes over to his father's house. One night, I turned my stereo on and put a disc in it. 5-disc CD changer. It was on disc 4, song number 11. There were 2 songs, and it should have switched to disc 5 after it was done with song 12. I took my shower and had the stereo loud enough to where I could hear it. All of a sudden, I didn't feel the vibration of the music anymore. I thought, well, maybe it's at a quiet part. When I got out of the shower, I still heard nothing. I put my ear to the door. Nothing. I went out and looked at the stereo, and it was not on CD anymore, but on FM radio on 100.1. And that is not a station at all. It's just fuzz. There was no one else in the house but me and my cat. That was on a Friday night. 2 days later, on a Sunday night, my son and I were watching television around the same time, between 9:45 and 10 p.m. In the middle of television, the radio goes from auxiliary to FM radio, 100.1, fuzz. My son says, "Mom, what did you do? I was watching that." I told him I didn't do anything. On a Saturday, my son was at his father's, and I was there alone with the cat, and she started going crazy. At one point, she was standing in the doorway of my room in the living room, looking at me. She meowed and took off like crazy into the back bedroom belonging to my youngest son. She came racing back into the living room. Just then I heard a loud boom coming from the room, like something fell. It shook the entire house. My stomach had butterflies in it then, and I got up to go see. My son won tall dresser with small bionicle toys on it, but they were still all on there. There wasn't anything else that could fall from any place. I've always heard pipes rattling under the house since I moved in. Out of the corner of my eye, I always see things dart quickly about. I haven't seen it fall on, but I know it moves quick. I haven't took pictures of my home yet, or of it for that matter. Also, I have a 2-car garage. Sometimes when me and my son pull up from school, both garage doors are closed. In the morning, sometimes the right one is open. I've never really been a great believer, but for the past 8 or so years, since me and my mom moved from our old flat to our new house, I've experienced numerous experiences. The first one I was about 6. My bedroom is the box room, and so it's small. My bed touches each side of the room with the door to the left. I was laying in bed waiting for my grandma, who was babysitting, to bring me water. I looked up at the wall and saw a strange shadow. It was like a side profile of someone's head. I could see the nose, mouth, and hair clearly. It could have been my own shadow, since the only light came from the ceiling, and I was lying down in bed. I watched it for a few seconds, then it seemed to fade before my eyes. I thought it was just because I was tired, and so I ignored it. I had no further experiences until 7 years later, in 2003. I was laying in bed once again, the light off about 12 o'clock at night. I was really tired and was trying to fall asleep. My bedroom had been rearranged so that the door was opposite my bed, and one side of my bed was pushed against the wall. I had my back to the wall and was staring into the darkness when I felt a cold breeze on the back of my neck. Thinking it was just a drought, I rolled over the face of the wall. On the wall, probably 3 inches from my face, was another face. I could tell it was a man, and he had a black hood up. All I could see of his face was a pair of cold eyes, and what I can only describe as green paint, a face paint on his cheek. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, thinking I was just seeing things, and when I opened them again, the face was still there. I don't know how long I stared at it, but in the end, I fell asleep, and in the morning, could find no trace of what was there the night before. These sightings carried on for weeks, always appearing on the wall at night. I didn't tell my mom about the face, but asked if I could move my bed back to the original place. We moved it, and I slept peacefully that night. The following night I went to bed about 2 o'clock, since I'd been up watching a movie on television. I got in bed as usual, and rolled over to face the radiator, like I'd done for years, but the face was there again. This time, however, it was more vivid and real. It seemed to be sneering in the dark, and more threatening than before. I rolled over so my back was to the wall, but I could feel the cold breeze that I had felt the last few weeks whenever the face appeared. I pulled the covers around me, refusing to look back at the face. The incidents got less frequent over the weeks, and I believed that the face was going. One night, I was sat at my computer in the corner of my living room. I have a cockatiel whose cage is right next to the computer desk, who was asleep, and my mom was in the kitchen making a drink. I didn't really notice anything until I heard my bird start to hiss and back away into the corner of the cage. Wondering what frightened him, I heard a scraping noise. I looked to the side of the computer to see my glass moving towards the edge of the desk. There was no way it could be moving, because of our house being set on a rise, because it is where it should be sliding the other way. I lifted my hand to stop the glass from falling off the desk. When I touched it, the glass was cold, even though I hadn't had a cold drink in it. The strangest thing was when I went to push the glass back, I couldn't. Something was trying to push the glass. I had to shove it quite hard before I could get the glass to move. When I did, my bird came back to the front of the cage and looked as though nothing had happened. I'd gone to bed earlier than my mom that night and must have been asleep when she came up. Once again, the face was there, but this time, the presence was really strong. My bedroom was icy cold when it normally is the hottest room in the house. Almost 1 o'clock, I wake up shivering and could feel something gripping my arm, but as I come to, it released its grip. I rolled over to see the face once again, but it looked different. The smirk had gone, and looked more angry than anything else. I didn't sleep that night, and I couldn't sleep in the room, so I spent the night sat on my sofa with the lights on downstairs. When my mom came down in the morning, she was shocked to see me up, but I just said I had woken up early and came down. I didn't want her to know. Later that afternoon, we were having dinner when she asked if I had a nightmare last night. I couldn't recall anything but the face and cold hand, so I asked why. She said she had heard me talking in my sleep, which I had never done before that. She said I was telling someone to get away and don't touch me over and over. Then after about 5 minutes, I was quieter and mumbling things like, "Why are you doing this?" and "just go away." When I asked her what time, she said it was about 12:30, just before I woke up with a hand gripping my arm. I haven't seen the face or had any strange experiences since that night, and I'm not quite sure what happened after. I don't know if I did something to make it all go away, and that was why the man's face looks so angry, but I'm glad they're gone. I still expect to see the face every night, but so far I haven't. I finally told my mom about it all, and she asked if I wanted to have the house blessed, but I said no, although the scary face did no harm to anyone, and it's gone now anyway. My story happened about 2 years ago over a period of 8 months, and I'm so glad I no longer live in the same house. We moved to our current house because we had to, but the happenings in our house just encouraged us even more. As I'm trying to write this, I've just remembered something else that happened when I was 14 years old. My parents split up when I was 14, and my sisters were both 11 and 9. I'd always believed that negative energy could cause occurrences, and so it was no surprise to me when things went a bit strange in our house. First thing that happened was that the TV in my chest of drawers would shake from side to side, which was just not possible. I put it down to reverberations elsewhere in the house, but this was not the case. Second, after returning home one night, I came home and went straight into my room without turning the light on. However, I could see from the light coming in from the hallway. The picture I had on my wall came flying off the wall sideways and hit the door side on, and to this day, there is still a massive dent where it made contact. My younger sister also claimed to have seen the figure of a young girl standing beside her bed one morning. However, I was quick to dismiss it, as I felt as though if I acknowledged it, it would become real. Nothing else happened until 6 years later. We were in our new flat. My mom, me and 2 sisters, and everything was totally normal, up until I'd say about 1 month of being there. Can't really remember the exact order of events, except that last and final one. My sister Jane had told my mom that she had been in bed the night before and had the feeling of someone pushing the covers down at either side of her, like almost trapping her in the bed, but she put it down to being really tired. My mom, being the world's biggest skeptic, said she was havering and to get a grip on reality and to not mention it to her younger sister Gemma, as it would freak her out. She did not tell me also until after a few things happened. A couple of days later, my younger sister Gemma comes to my mom with identical story and automatically assumes they are both in on it and are trying to wind her up, but when both are confronted, denied all knowledge, and my mom began to think along the lines that they may be telling the truth. By now, I know about the whole thing, and so as you can imagine, I'm slightly apprehensive about going to sleep at night. I was in my bed one night, and I had a room of my own, so I was last up in the house, and I think I was reading a book or something. My cat Hajma was laying on the bed, next to my thigh, and leaning on it. I was the only one who allowed him to sleep in my room, because I always felt safer with him there. I heard a noise outside my room, nothing you could really put a name to, and I started to read again, and I looked at Hamish. The next part is a little weird, but I swear it happened. Hamish was lifted 6 inches straight up in the air, still in his curled up position. I freaked. The cat meowed really loudly and ran from the room. I then went into my mom's room because I was slightly petrified. Now, my mom was sure something was happening, yet nothing had happened to her. I was now beginning to think that maybe it was negative energy, again, because this house move had been a result of the breaking up of my parents, and my mom really didn't want to live in the house, and she was miserable, and we were in turn miserable because she was. So 2 months passed with nothing happening, until my sisters and I went to Ireland with my dad on holiday, and left my mom in this house on her own for a week. I phoned my mom whilst we were away, and she seemed on edge, but wouldn't say what was wrong, so that she didn't spoil our holiday, but I had a feeling it was about the house. When we got back, she told me that one night she had went to sleep, and she always kept the bedroom door shut, and the way the doors are, you can't just push them to get in, you have to physically turn the handle, which was good, because it meant my mom could keep the cat out. She said she was just drifting off to sleep, and she felt the bottom corner of the bed being depressed, as if someone had just sat on it. She thought at first it was the cat, and had gotten to the room, but when she put the light on the door, it was still completely closed. She then put it down to her imagination, and tried to fall back asleep. Then she felt the same feeling of the covers being pushed down, at either side of her, and she also felt a pressure on her chest, like someone was sitting on it. She tried to sit up but couldn't, and she also couldn't reach the bedside lamp, and the next thing she knew, something hit her really hard in the face, full force, and the chest pressure released instantly. She couldn't sleep again, and that night, she spent the night in my grand's house. We came back from holiday, and I then had to spend the last 9 months sleeping in the same room as my mom, as she was too scared. She was so convinced of something bad in the house that she went as far as to go to the library to check what was on the land previously, as these flats had been up for about 3 years. The library couldn't help, as they had no files. My mom gave up, until my sister met a lady at the bottom of her street who spoke to her unexpectedly and said that she had lived in the area all her life and knew we were new. My sister took the opportunity to ask if she knew what was there before the flats had been. She claimed that the car park to the flats had been once completely sealed with a wrought iron fence over 6 feet high that you could not see through, and the home beyond the fence was that of a scandalized counselor, and there was a lot of mystery surrounding his death. We have since found out that this was true, but there's virtually no information on the counselor or the land on which he lived. Now, needless to say, my mom is not a skeptic, and nothing has happened in her new house.